Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course preview for this week's Houston Open. Different time of the year, which is going to change Memorial Park significantly, and going to go through everything you need to know about this venue to go out there and get your research started. Whether you're playing DFS over there on the prop side, betting outrights, we're going to go over what to expect from course conditions to help you select some of your top end plays. And because of that date change, we've got a lot of changes we have to talk about here. And frankly, a golf course that I think is going to play a lot differently than what we saw for the last 4 or 5 years here, and overall probably a different type of modeling required than what we had there for the November version. So let's get into here. Going to do this in a quick, concise format. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. The first thing I want to note are some of the changes here because of the date change. So mostly it deals with the agronomy, right? The grasses are just 9-day difference from what we had in November, where if you remember back to the Cadence Bank Houston Open, so same golf course, same event, but different sponsor, everything was Bermuda grass, right? Whether it was the greens, fairways, rough, all of that was Bermuda. You had about a 2.5-inch Bermuda grass rough, and your greens were Mine Verde Bermuda. But because of the fact we're playing in the spring now, a much more wet season, not really that dry climate that you're used to in Texas, now everything is going to be an overseed. So it's the same type of agronomy that we have down here in the Florida swing, transplanted about 2-3 hours west over there to Houston. So it's quite a different situation when it comes to the golf course, not just from looking at some of the averages, right? It's a POA overseed that you have at most spots, a rye overseed when it comes to the rough, but it's also going to play a lot softer. Over there in Texas during this spring, it is by far the wettest season of the year, which means that the firm rolling out fairways that you're used to over there probably aren't going to be present. The course is going to play a little bit longer with that. The greens, I would say, would be easier to hit, also more receptive because of the softer conditions. And on top of that, the rough this time, and I think this is maybe the biggest change, is only 1.25 inches. So maybe the shortest rough that we have on the entire schedule. And it's that perennial ryegrass overseed, which is about half the length of the rough that we had for the other events here at the Houston Open. And on top of that, it's not Bermuda, right? Bermuda is known to be sticky, some of the most penal stuff out there. Now you're talking about next to no rough. So we're going to focus on some of the changes, how I would model for them when we get to the custom model section, but there are quite a few changes here this year. A few things that aren't changing. The par of the course, it is a par 70, a little bit of a unique setup with 3 par 5s and 5 par 3s, but still par 70, 7,412 yards. And though this was a Bredemus design back in the day, that was only a 9-hole course, and really the architect that we want to consider here, especially for some of our correlation stuff and comps, is going to be Tom Doak, who renovated this in 2019, brought it from just a municipal course into a legit PGA Tour stop, still a public course, so you can play it down there in Houston, but definitely a much more top-level establishment. So Tom Doak design, par 70, pretty long par 70 at 7,400 yards, and then all of those changes with the agronomy that we went through. So a few things to note, right? If we take a look at some of the recent form here, course history, even some of the stat averages over here on the prop side, I really don't think it's going to play the same. In fact, in the past, this had played pretty difficult with Tony Finau running away with it at 16 under par. But if you go back to 2021, 2020 as well, you had really low winning scores taking it home, which I think had a lot to do with the firm conditions. The greens weren't all that easy to hit. There was slightly below the tour average there. Your fairway percentage was also lower than your tour average. Your scrambling rate slightly lower. I mean, you name it, right? Across the board, this place was pretty difficult. But now that it's in the wet season, you're going to have no doubt about it. Softer turf conditions. Not only has the weather been slightly more rainy than what we had last year, on top of that, it's an overseeded golf course. And if you're familiar with Florida agronomy, if you're familiar with this part of the schedule, every course, even if it's super dry out, plays soft down in Florida because they have to water all of that overseed. So you saw that at API, you see it at Players every single year when they play it over here in March. And that is going to come over here to the Houston Open. So what that's going to lead to is a higher fairway average, right? So I think it might actually be over 60% this year. Your green average might be higher than 66%. So you might see guys, on average hitting like 12 of the 18 greens. Your scrambling rate, you'll probably stay the same, right? Probably not going to see see a huge difference there, but birdies will probably be more plentiful, right? Even when you miss fairways, it's going to lead to next to no penalty out there. Your bogey average is probably going to go down too, right? With that missed fairway penalty pretty much being non-existent this week. And I think if you're looking at course history, if you're just taking a look at the last few years of data, I don't know how helpful it's going to be. So a lot of times, right, we do a deep dive into the leaderboards, we look at lead inform, all of that. I think it's a complete waste of time this week. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Again, this is going to be a more concise preview because of that. I wanted to keep it quick to begin with, but given all of that, it even more so leans into it. So hopping over here to Data Golf to take a look at the approach distribution, you can see that there's a lot more from this 200 to 225 range. Also a slightly higher average there from 250 out. One thing I'll note is that some of the players in the field, especially your longer players in the field, the range for them that might be more affected is this 175 to 200. So your shorter hitters are going to be hitting a lot from 200 plus. So your Kevin Kisners, right? Those sort of players are definitely going to be reaching for hybrid 3-iron quite a bit. But your longer players, your elite tier guys like a Tony Finau, for example, their range that's going to be overutilized is this 175 to 200. So that's just something I want to note, right? This is the average cross section for the field that we have over here on Data Golf. So just know that based on your driving distance, it's going to look a whole lot more, whole lot different, I should say, heading in for your second shot. So it's still a long iron golf course. You're still going to be hitting some sort of iron from like 6-iron and up for a lot of your approach shots. For some players, right, that might be a 3-4 iron for some of your shorter players on tour, whereas your Tony Finau's, your Scotty Schefflers, for example, are going to be more in that 175 to 200. Last year, the missed fairway penalty was lower than your tour average at 0.29 shots per round. This time around, I think it's going to be even lower than that. So probably closer to like 0.2 shots per round, meaning that driving accuracy, which, already in the past was like maybe average in terms of importance, is probably going to be next to irrelevant out there for this kind of week. Heading over to the course fit tool, so just looking at their relative importance, right, what they think about Memorial Park, you can see they had it as a very average golf course. So with these changes, I think you're going to see a slightly different identity. We'll talk about it later, but I think driving distance is going to be super helpful this week. And I also think that approach play, your second shot, with not all that many penalties off the tee, is probably where you're going to separate yourself. So in the past, you can see, right, driving distance maybe slightly more important than usual. Your approach stuff here was actually slightly less important than your average tour course. I don't think it's going to be this same sort of plot, right, when we circle back to this in 2025. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but now let's go through a hole by hole breakdown and give you an idea what these players are going to face. We're going to quickly go hole by hole here, but what you'll notice is that this isn't a Florida golf course, right? You're not going to get a bunch of water in between every single hole. And though there are some trees out there, it's far from one of those Carolina, tree-lined golf courses. So with the rough that's only about an inch this year, there's not going to be much penalty off the tee. And hole number 1 is actually one of your more difficult holes on property. The reason for that, it is a converted par 5. So, it says par 5 over here, but the tour will be playing it as a par 4. And the way they do that is they move up at one tee box. So it'll play about 480 yards, maybe 500 yards to some of the, middle to back pin locations. Your drive out here is to a small landing area. Really hard fairway to hit. It's a par 5. It's not designed to be a wide landing area, which is why you'll see a low fairway rate here. But with only 1-inch rough, they're going to have no problem getting it up near the green. And in fact, are probably going to have a good chance at holding that green complex. Hole 2 is 162 yards. It is one of the shorter par 3s on site. And honestly, a pretty straightforward hole. Hole 3 is 588. This is a par 5, so will be definitely a scoreable look, but a lot longer than hole number 1. So that's why they chose to convert that hole to make this the par 70, and one that a lot of players will get home in 2 on. And even if you miss it in the rough because it's so short, you might get it up there near the complex. Hole 4 is a longer par 4. Tee shot here, you can block yourself out to the right. One of the more dense areas when it comes to the trees, but wide fairway, right? One of the larger fairways that you have on site, and the green complex is pretty simple too. Hole 5 is 392. This is one of the shorter par 4s on property. They might even move this up in terms of its tee box one of the 4 days. I don't believe they did it last year, but it would make sense for a hole of this length. They do that on some of the back 9 holes, so we'll talk through, right, a few of the tee boxes that might be moved up. But hole 5 is one where you could potentially see that too. Hole 6 is 442, mid-length par 4, large landing area. So once again, it's not an easy hole, right? Especially to a tough pin location. But it's a mid-length par 4. You hit the fairway, you're gonna have a wedge in. Probably a birdie look for a good amount of players. Hole 7 is 215, so a longer par 3. This one is a little bit more demanding than you had at hole number 2. Hole 8 is 610 yards, so this is a par 5, not converted to a par 4, of course, and a little bit harder to reach into. You also do have this OB to the right, which could come into play, but yeah, most players, right, they're going to at least get it up here near the green in 2 shots, and should be a birdie look for most players. Hole 9 is another par 3, so you're third on the front side. Just again, 5 of them on property, more than most courses. And it's a hole 200 yards. So you technically have water in play short here, but unless it's a front pin location, really doesn't come into play. I guess a back right pin, you could, in theory, hit it into the lake, but more so just a long, demanding iron shot than anything. If you're starting on the back, you get much more of a handshake to start your round. So if you're on that split tee setup, these are the guys that are probably going to have the easiest starting hole. It's a 454, it's a mid-length par 4, and not much that has to be said. Hole 11 is 241, so a longer par 3, demanding iron shot for sure. Hole 12 is 502 yards. This is a longer par 4, one of the harder holes in property too, as you would imagine. That bunker there is a little bit nasty as well. Hole 13 is a hole that they may shorten up. Last year they played it, I believe one of the 4 rounds, they moved it up here a little bit, but a short little pitch and putt par 4 regardless. 14 is not a par 5, so this is a par 4. It is going to play the same distance. I've already moved up the tee box here to account for it. So it'll be in like the 480 yard range for all 4 days. Hole 15 is 153 yards, shorter par 3, kind of similar to hole 2, right? Should be a pretty scoreable look. Hole 16 is 575. This one is reachable in 2, but you do have water in play, which makes you think about it a little bit. And finally, hole 17, you got 411 yards, another hole with that water to the right. But, if you hit the fairway, it's a wedge in, and they have moved the screen back, so it's going to play a little bit longer here in 2024. It's back here where this little clearing is. So it's still next to the water, right? But it is adding some distance, and they added a few bunkers there at 17 too. And then finally, hole 18 is 495. This is a longer par 4. It's a great finishing hole for this kind of golf course. But as you can see, right, there's not water on these 500-yard holes. The rough's going to be down, so it's not going to play like a Farmers Insurance Open, right, where you're having all these long par 4s with like 4-inch rough. It's nowhere near that kind of test. Now, the one thing I'll say is that an underrated aspect of this course would be around the green. These fairway areas, they look pretty straightforward for getting up and down, but there's some tight lies. Last year, they were Bermuda grass. This year, it'll be overseed, so a little bit of a different challenge here in 2024. But they're not super simple. Right? I mean, they're elevated greens. They've got some slope to them. They ran them pretty quick last year. I should say back in 2022 when we saw this event in November. But it's an underrated aspect of the golf course. So if you're going to miss greens, you don't want to miss many of them to begin with. But you better be proficient at getting up and down, or you're going to get exposed a little bit out there at Memorial. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with Memorial Park, let's talk through some of my key stats and comps for this week that I'll be using for some of my analysis and for my modeling, of course. So I think the number one thing that I think is more important this year, it's not my number one key stat, but definitely in terms of relevance to last time we played here, is going to be a lot more important in 2024, is ball speed, driving distance. However you want to look at this sort of metric, with the lack of rough, it's essentially a golf course without penalty off the tee. Now, a few of those finishing holes, right, they have that water on it, but outside of that, it's bombs away here, right? If you happen to get behind a tree, like you might get screwed once, maybe twice the entire week, you're going to just be bombing it away, hoping to hit a bunch of greens and then putt, right? That's the simple strategy for this week. And anytime there's no penalty for missing, right, there's no real difference between, honestly, being in the fairway or in that 1-inch rough. I don't care about driving accuracy. In fact, last year you did see a little bit of correlation, or last time we played here, to driving distance. I don't think you're going to see that at all here. So if you're just looking at pure ball speed, you got guys like Cameron Champ up there, Goddard up, an absolute flusher, who is probably a sleeper play at this sort of golf course, but Wyndham Clark, Doherty, guys like Toasty hits it an absolute mile. Gary Woodland's still doing his thing there. Johnny Vegas, Callum Turan, but guys like Jake Knapp, Tony Finau, right? Guys like Wyndham Clark, right? These elite tier sort of players, they're really going to separate themselves with that elite tier distance. So I'm not looking at ball speed to extract yourself from any sort of rough. It is just pure a distance game out there, right? I want the guys that are going to hit the ball, give themselves a lot of wedges, and kind of like I was mentioning during the details section, if you're a longer player, you're not going to have a bunch of 200 plus yard approaches. If you can get it out there 310, 320, like I think you'll be able to this year, you're going to have that 175 to 200 yard range, which, isn't a short iron, right? You're not scoring like you would from 100 yards, but you're going to do a whole lot better, right, than hitting 220, 250 yard approaches all day. So I think that driving distance is going to kind of, rear its head this year because of a lot of the changes that we have. And it's not just the rough, it's also the time of year, right? It's softer out there. It's going to be a golf course without as much run out. Historically, these Texas golf courses, are bumpy when they play them later in the year. And when you have that bouncy effect, like you'll get at Colonial in the summer, right? You'll get at this event, right? When it was back there in November, the Kisners, the more accurate drivers showed up, right? You'd see them, play Texas because they know that. I don't think you're going to see that kind of rollout, which is just going to add even more emphasis on driving distance, which regardless of golf course is a huge asset to have. Next up, I just want to look at regular old approach. And, I kind of mentioned that off the tee, right, driving distance will be helpful, but it's not the end all be all, right? So I'm not just taking bombers at this kind of golf course. My number one key stat, right, I mentioned, right, driving distance would not be number one. Number one is approach, because if everyone's going to have the same baseline off the tee, right, if we're saying that off the tee, other than your distance, it's going to be really hard to separate yourself, that it's a second shot golf course, right? That's kind of what a second shot golf course is when you go out there and you really win based on your iron shots. Well, Tom Hoge, absolutely flushing it. Keith Mitchell, we know, absolutely flushing it. But guys like Scotty, right? These elite tier iron players, if you have both, right? Driving distance and that approach accuracy, that's really the sweet combination I'm looking for. So Scotty checks that, we know that, right? Keith Mitchell, of course, a bomber and hits it really accurate on approach. Knapp, Finau, right? Checking those boxes. Wyndham Clark, of course, are players that I'd look to there. These are the kind of guys that I think are going to separate themselves this week. So they're getting that boost off the tee. They're also just some of the best second shot players on tour. Putting, of course, that's always a factor, but if you're just looking for high floor players, guys that are projecting for those top 20s, those top 10s, it's the bombers that are good on approach. I think that's the absolute nuts combination this week. And if you're a little bit inaccurate off the tee, I do not give a rat's ass. So somebody like a Wyndham Clark, it's a huge boost, right? If you're not looking at driving accuracy. Tony Finau, you could say that about Jake Knapp, right? Maybe not the most accurate drivers. Victor Perez is another player that fits that. A Parker Cootie is extremely long off the tee and also just not very accurate. Really good iron player. Davis Thompson, same sort of thing. These kind of players are the ones that I think are going to have some inherent value. A few players that maybe get a little bumped down. So Keith Mitchell, Scotty Scheffler, they're long and they're accurate off the tee. I don't think that accuracy is going to be nearly as important this week. So it's not like I hate Keith Mitchell or Scotty. They're two of my top modeling plays as well. This is, of course, the bet the number up model over here, which has been extremely useful here in 2024. And you love to see that Keith and Scotty are up there in the top three for them as well. So it's not like I hate them by any means. My modeling absolutely loves them this week. But I think the guys that have that value, that maybe the stats aren't even going to point you to, are those guys that are more inaccurate. It's a perfect setup for those kind of golfers. So a few guys I just want to point out here. So they maybe aren't popping up on the approach stuff, but if you just sort this by model ranking, I want to go find Ryan Fox, who the stats aren't really going to point him out, right? He's down here at number 51 per the bet the number model. A little bit better in the model that I ran with slightly different stats, right, than what they're using over here. But he's the type of guy who's only been losing off the tee because he's inaccurate. He's been hitting like 40% of fairways this year, which normally is an issue, right? Especially in Florida, where you have all that water, even that 4-inch rough, right, that we had at the Players and API. Like, that's not going to work at that kind of golf course. But this week, that's totally fine. He's one of the longest players in the world, and you can see that he's still been gaining putting. He had one really good week at the WM where he gained over 5 strokes putting, and he's been a really consistent iron player. So, he's missed a bunch of cuts, right? His only made cut was the Cognizant out of the last 4. Before that WM, he did make a cut there as well. The issue with a lot of stat models, right, is we've been playing courses that aren't this type of setup, right? So guys like Ryan Fox are going to be a sleeper play on this sort of week. Cam Davis, I think, is another perfect example of a player that could pop at this sort of golf course. It reminds me a lot of what we had at the Rocket Mortgage Classic, Detroit Golf Club, which, hint, hint, is going to be one of the comp courses that we go through. But, a lot of these kind of guys' form is just going to be utter dog shit because of the fact that they're playing a completely different style golf course. So, the reason why I go through that is they're the obvious guys up top, right? Flushing it, long off the tee, checking all those boxes. Everyone's going to play them. They're going to be extremely chalky this week. Now, they're maybe not leaning into this narrative with the driving distance as much as I'm going to be on this sort of week, but they're still going to be popular. The guys I think that these stats, the modeling, all that is really going to help you out this week are with guys like Ryan Fox, those players that maybe weren't playing as well. So Cameron Champ has obviously, turned it around last week at the Valspar, played particularly well there. But, if we're going down here and fishing for sleepers like a Taylor Pendrith, right, I think would be a potential sleeper to look at. Let's find somebody that's really flushing it and long off the tee. Luke List, right? He's not very accurate off the tee, but obviously flushing it. One of the best iron players in the world. Let's find a few others on here. So we're just looking for iron play and length off the tee. Ryan Fox is, I think, my favorite example out of the entire field. Davis Thompson, right, losing off the tee but gaining on approach. He's the type of player that this course would, I think we already mentioned it, right, would favor quite a bit out there. And there's not that many in this field, actually, that are flushing it, that fit that kind of description. Like Scott Stallings is another, right? Losing off the tee, he's long off the tee, but gaining with the irons. This is the perfect type of setup for them. Steven Yeager normally hits his irons better, so that's slightly concerning, but he would normally love this sort of golf course. Johnny Vegas, right, he's normally a little bit better with his irons, so that's why I didn't point him out there, but this is also the type of golf course that really fits his game. Even a guy like Patrick Rogers, right, who just can't hit a fairway for his life most times, are the players that get a huge advantage at Memorial Park. Guess a few other things I'd look at around the green. If you're playing fantasy, don't even consider this whatsoever. But I guess for your top 5, top 10s, it's worth looking at. As I mentioned during the hole-by-hole breakdown, this golf course is underrated around the green. And if you take a look at some of your top finishers last year, they were guys that were popping in this category, right? Just in particular, Ben Taylor, guys like a Tyson Alexander, they're all about the short game, and that's how they got to the top last year. So I think in fantasy, right, that was helpful too. Those top 5 placement points mattered a whole lot. It's not going to help you with that fantasy scoring aspect. So again, I think the approach play is number one. It pretty much always should be number one, but especially at a second shot golf course, that off the tee stuff's going to help you with ball speed. Green and regulation percentage, another way to look at some iron play stats. With how penal the around the green shots can be here, I could definitely see an argument for looking at green and regulation. Guys that pop there that maybe aren't popping as much with their actual approach play. You got guys like Billy Horschel up there, Norn, Adam Long, right, popping a little bit more in greens than they are for their approach stats. Lindheim, that's a small sample size thing, I'd imagine. Pan Kazire too, right, guys that are maybe slightly better with green and regulation than they are their actual approach stats. I definitely by far want to look at these approach stats because there's a lot less noise in them. They're a lot less susceptible to variance than what you have over here with green and regulation. And just because a guy is hitting it to like 50 feet on a green, like, you're not going to make that for birdie. That you could still easily 3-putt, right, from 50, 55 feet. So it can be a little bit misleading, but if you're trying to break a tie out there choosing between players, it's not the worst idea to go out there and use as an extra data point. So yeah, for me, guys, it's the approach play. It's the distance that I'm really considering. You can't ignore putting, right? Particularly on this POA overseed at any golf tournament, let alone at this event where last year there were a lot of guys that gained with the putting up top. Worth noting that Tony Finau, right, your winner, you wouldn't expect him to have a good putting week. He gained over 7 strokes putting last year. Guys like Ben Taylor, Tyson Alexander went absolutely off with the putter as well. I think it's going to be a little bit different here in 2024 because of the, all the changes that we've talked about. But putting still going to matter a little bit. So you can't completely ignore it when you're going out there and you're building a custom model. But it is a little bit further down the board in my model this year than what we had for the last time here at Memorial Park. Our comps for this week aren't going to be nearly as easy to find because we haven't seen this golf course, right, this time of year. But using some of just my intuition, right, going through the changes, just logically trying to figure out how it's going to play, I think that Rocket Mortgage, already mentioned Detroit Golf Club before, is probably a good comparison. And the reason I say that is I think that you're going to see this course play a little bit more straightforward. I think you're going to see more birdies this year. And while you're probably not going to have the prolific scoring that we get over here at the Rocket Mortgage, I think that the accuracy off the tee not mattering, right, is probably going to be translatable from golf course to golf course. And I mean, if you look at this leaderboard here, right, off the tee didn't really mean all that much at last year's event, we should say. It was all about approach play. It was all about the putting. I don't think it's going to be nearly as putting heavy this week over here at this event, but I do think the approach profiles line up quite well. It's another type of golf course with a lot of undulation on the greens. And in general, you had a lot of guys show up at this event that, could not hit a fairway for their life, right? We hit the Ricky out right here last year. He was up there at the top. You did have guys like Hadman Morikawa show up who aren't horrible players off the tee by any means, but if we go to the year before that, right, Tony Finau won. A lot of guys like Pendrith showed up. Cameron Young don't hit very many fairways. You go down to the year before that, right? Cam Davis won. That was a year where we were really just looking for guys who kind of sprayed it off the tee. You had Joaquin Niemann show up there. Guys like Brandon Hagee, who literally could not hit a fairway for his life. Same thing with Bubba Watson. That's the crossover that I'm looking at. So again, it's not a great week when it comes to the comp courses, but Rocket Mortgage would fit partially that description that we're looking for. So let's go through a few others. So we're essentially looking for courses where driving accuracy is not going to matter as much, and the Masters might be the best example of that. Now, unfortunately, not everyone in this field is going to have history there. In fact, it's only going to be like a third of the field, maybe a fourth of the field that you're going to have that data to work with. But at the Masters tournament, right, it's a hard course to get up and down. They've got super undulated greens. It's, of course, a lot harder to make birdies, harder to make bogeys. Most years, especially when it was in November, the Masters was a number one comp course for this sort of event. It's still a comp that I think you can look at, but probably not the best data to consider. So it's not going to load much up here. I don't think they have all the Masters stuff completely loaded in, but even though it was my number one comp last year, it's still something that I'm looking at, but probably not as much of a correlation because, again, I don't think it's going to play as difficult as what we have historically have seen at this event. And the last one we'll look at, and again, there's not a lot of great comps for this. You could take a look at John Deere if you wanted to. A course where driving accuracy doesn't matter as much. It's just not all that common on the PGA Tour, right? We don't see them very often. So we could probably even cut it off with these two and we'd be just fine. If we had to find another one to add in, Mexico Open is one, right? It's all about driving distance. It's not about the accuracy at all. Tony Finau has, of course, won that event twice. He's won this event out here just the last year. So Mexico Open, I don't think is the worst comp that you can use. It looks like maybe my internet's a little bit slow right here, but these aren't the best kind of comps to use because first off, the agronomy is different at like every single golf course. We don't have that data to work with, but we look at it. Jake Knapp played well here. Again, we're looking for that bomber with good iron play. You'll see that there. Valimaki is that sort of player, right? Not accurate, but very long off the tee. Guys like Patrick Rogers showed up, right? I thought that this golf course is a pretty good setup for him. Let's see. Let's go back to the year before that. So when Tony Finau won, right? John Rahm finished in second, but it's a lot of guys here that are really good iron players, right? Like an Eric Cole, not known for his off the tee play, right? But ended up finishing top 5. Grillo, same thing. Smotherman, right? Not accurate at all off the tee. Cameron Champ showing up, right? So if we're looking for bombers, he definitely shows up at that golf course. It's sneakily, and this is kind of crazy to me, Ben Taylor shows up, right? Who nearly, he topped 3'd at this event last year, is showing up at this comp course. So actually, I said Detroit Golf Club might be my favorite comp. Just looking at the leaderboard crossover and whatnot, and we don't have a ton of data, right? It's 2, maybe 3 years at the Mexico Open. It's enough that we can at least somewhat consider it, right? But year before that, John Rahm won. It was Rahm went one and then Tony Finau won. I had that a little bit backwards there. But look at that, Tony Finau in second, right? Brandon Wu, who showed up here almost every single year, might be worth a look at this week. Cameron Champ showing up. Again, that just bomber narrative. Patrick Rogers showing up. There's a lot of names that continually show up here, right? Like Steven Yeager showed up in the top 10 there last year. Let's keep going down here. Adam Long showing up. He's actually playing in the field this week. Maybe you can find some of your sleeper plays down there. So let's go Mexico Open 1. You have Detroit Golf Club number 2. And I guess we'll put, what was the other one we took? Masters right down at number 3. So Masters historically, right, would be our number 1 comp here, but I don't think it's going to look like that firm, fast, super hard around the green golf course that we usually had back in November. So if we're looking at the Masters data, right, guys like Rahm showing up there, of course, right, he's won at the Mexico Open as well. But in terms of sleeper plays, you're not really going to find them because it's such a top-end field. Cameron Champ showed up a few years ago, right? He top 10. So, there is that little bit of crossover, I guess, that we could look at there. But, a lot of these guys aren't even playing this week, right? It's that top level of a field. It's a major championship where, Justin Rose, right? He played well at the Masters. He played well at this event last year, was in the final group second to final group there. But you're not going to have a lot of these players to even compare to. So Robert McIntyre back in 2021 finished top 12. He also played well at the Mexico Open. So that's maybe a sleeper play that you could consider. But there's other two golf courses I think are better comparisons for this week. And we're going to have much better data for because they're full field events. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hop in out of here, go ahead, smash that like button for me. And if you want to get entered into a chance to win a free month on my Patreon page, go ahead and comment what you've got as your winning score. I'm going to go ahead and take 16 under par as my winner. I do think it'll play easier this year than what we've had over the past few years. And though that is the same score that Tony Finau got to, he ran away with it last time around. So I think you're going to see more players towards that 16 under par score. But go ahead, let me know your thoughts down below. And again, get entered into a free chance to earn a month of my Patreon. Just get that winning score right. You'll get a free month access over there and can see what all of the tools and hype are about. But that's all I've got here for this breakdown. It's going to be a week where I think you can take advantage of this new course narrative, right? It's not a completely new course. It's not one that we haven't seen before, but I think it's going to play so much different here in the spring that we can kind of treat it like a brand new venue on tour. So my modeling is going to be very aggressive. It's going to be definitely a little bit speculative, but if we can get that course read right, and if we do truly see that driving distance come into play, we could be finding ourselves a lot of value towards the middle to bottom end of the board. And that's kind of what I'm looking for fantasy and for outright. So that's going to be the strategy this week. Also, comment down below with your winning score prediction, whether you think Scotty wins or not this week. It's going to be the question that everyone's asking, whether to play him in DFS or not. I don't really have a lean as of now. I'm a little bit worried about the neck, right? I want to see how his health looks heading into this week. But let me know your thoughts down below. And I guess whether you're going to be playing him for an outright this week, potentially taking him in DFS. Just curious to see your guys' thoughts down there. Well, that's all I've got. Subscribe so you don't miss any of the content throughout the week. We'll have a betting and DFS preview dropping on later this evening. Also, our weekly live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you got any questions, you want to see all the last second info that you need, we're going to go through weather there, DFS ownership, all of your questions down in live chat. That's the perfect place to go ahead and throw those questions. If you throw them down in the comments here, I'll try to get back to you. But if you for sure want my thoughts on anything, Wednesday at 7 p.m. is the spot to do it. That's all I've got, guys. Hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared for this week, and let's have ourselves a week at the Houston Open.